Hello and welcome back to Bookish and welcome to St. Patrick's Day. Yay, St. Patrick's Day. Maybe I'll put some bagpipes playing here over my shoulder. I do love bagpipe music. I don't know what that says about me. Anyway, I'm here with another tag because it's Tuesday. That means it's Tag Tuesday. And heck, like I told you yesterday, I'm doing a video every day this week. Hopefully you're enjoying the content, even though I realize I'm probably overwhelming my subscribers. This is good for me. It's keeping my mind occupied. It's allowing me to do something that I view as positive and to engage with a community of people whom I consider to be my friends, so I'm just going to keep going. The tag I'm here to do today is the Literary Quotation Contrarian tag. This is a tag created by Marc Nash over at his channel. I'll certainly leave a link to his excellent original tag video down below. He tagged me to do this, and thank you, Mark. I will say that this was a particularly challenging tag for me to do, which is, again, on the whole, from my point of view, a good thing. Because I'm not really a quote writer-downer, underliner, rememberer, particularly not quotes that I disagree with. And I think the point, or the idea behind this from Mark's point of view, was to think of quotes, or to come up with literary quotes that you disagree with. He does, though, allow for the idea that you could also agree with the quotes or like the quotes and be contrarian towards the point of his tag. So I'll be doing a little bit of that. But again, I'm not a great collector of quotations. It's just not one of those things I do. I'm not one of those people with a commonplace book, and I don't really keep up with quotes like that. I think I masquerade as a far more literate person than I actually am. So you're supposed to come up with 10. I came up with 6. I eliminated one to get down to 5 because the 6th one I had was from a BookTube prize book that I've read, and I didn't want to give that away. It didn't really fit in with the theme of the other 5. So the other 5 quotes I have all have something to do with history, either kind of how we think about history, kind of from a historian's point of view, how we think about the effects of history on our lives every day, how history is oftentimes misrepresented, how we accept things as works of history that we really shouldn't, and they have a long-term impact. Ike, you're okay, buddy. On our perceptions of things, and then just how history can be done really badly. The reason for this obsession with history is that that's my training. That's what my degrees are in history. That's what I teach, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about history. Anyway, so the first quote comes from this biography of Marco Polo by Lawrence Bergreen. And this is, for me, this quote for me is an example of doing history badly. While I do think that historians can interpret from the original sources they get and sometimes extrapolate ideas and information, this is an example, I think, of doing it wrong. So this, again, is a book about Marco Polo, and there's a passage in here around page 71 which really kind of bothered me, in part because of where it led the author. So I'm just going to read the quote to you. And again, this is about Marco Polo. Amid the spectacular setting, something peculiar befell the young Marco, about which he dropped only the slenderest of hints. When he was in those parts, he remained sick for about a year, he says of himself, and when he was advised to go up to the mountain, by whom he does not say, he was well again. Those few words suggest an ordeal. It is unlikely that he contracted malaria, as is often assumed, since there are no mosquitoes at that high altitude to carry the parasite. Instead, he may have suffered the effects of syphilis or severe emotional problems, but more likely he had tuberculosis. The disease was prevalent in Europe during the years of his childhood. So, all of that in and of itself, and that quote, is not really all that problematic for me, even though he is going far afield and suggesting several things. He asserts that mosquitoes couldn't live the altitude at which he was living. Maybe. I don't know that to be true. He suggests that it might have been syphilis, and then doesn't ever pick that up again. or severe emotional problems, which he doesn't pick up again. And then he just states that he most likely had tuberculosis. Again, I'm not arguing that that might be the disease he was most likely to have had, but he does dismiss the other three, two without mentioning anything about, and one without based on a scientific thing. And the whole reason why I think he does this is so that he can talk about opium use, because he then goes on to suggest that if he had been suffering from tuberculosis in the place where he was located, then the most common treatment, he says, would have been opium, and then he would have become addicted to the remedy. There's a lot of speculation there from just that one little passage where Marco Polo says that essentially he was ill and he was laid up in one place for a year. We go from the accepted idea that he had malaria to just the mention of syphilis and emotional problems, and then to the statement that he had tuberculosis, and from the statement that he had tuberculosis to the idea that he would have been treated for tuberculosis with opium, to the idea that he would have become an opium addict, to the idea that he would have undergone the difficulties of weaning oneself or recovering from that addiction. And to me, that's a whole lot of speculation based on something that was itself a speculation. And this is one of the things in a work of history that kind of drives me crazy. I don't know if the author here is right or wrong, but I do know he's gone far afield from his source material to come up with this idea, which tells us two things: that Marco Polo suffered from tuberculosis and that he had become an opium addict. Neither one of which I think is really proved by any other source material anywhere available to the author. That kind of thing in history has a tendency to drive me crazy. As a matter of fact, I stopped reading that biography of Marco Polo at that point. I also then wanted to pick on one of my favorite writers here, and that's Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was great for a quote, and I think a lot of Hemingway's quotes are just incredibly bad. I think he thought of himself, particularly later in life, as being something of, a sage, a wise old man. I definitely think his ego told him that he knew more about anything he chose to talk about than anybody else. He was kind of that guy. One of his most famous quotes is his quote about where American literature came from, or modern American literature came from, and that's a quote from the Green Hills of Africa. And so here's the quote. This is Hemingway in his own book. All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. So that's the quote. And based on how widely Huckleberry Finn was for a really long period of time assigned to high school students to read, I think that quote, and certainly other people would have believed things similar about Twain, and I'm not making a statement about Mark Twain's work here at all, but certainly that quote seems to indicate and elevate Twain's importance above a lot of other people. There are a lot of problems with that quote, I think, in terms of history. If we go with that idea, that Twain is the creator of modern American literature, we leave out a lot of people, famous people, like Stephen Crane, who certainly played a role also, or Edith Wharton, whose books were really influential, even though very different from Hemingway. And we're also forgetting that before Twain, there had to be some kind of foundation from which Twain emerged and from which his writing emerged. He didn't just spring, fully formed as the writer of Huckleberry Finn from Hannibal, Missouri. There had to be some influence, and obviously there is influence there. At the very least, we can trace influences on Twain back to Thoreau, back to Ralph Waldo Emerson and his call for American authors and artists to create things that were American. Certainly that is what Twain is doing, and so I don't think we can credit, and I find it disturbing that, based maybe on a quote from Hemingway, many people credit Twain with creating all modern American literature. It's far more complicated than that. By the way, I imagine that Hemingway would have scoffed at the idea that Walt Whitman had any role to play in the creation of modern American literature, but I think you can find definite connections between Whitman and Twain. Anyway, so there's a quote from Hemingway, and then the quote I think is the most damaging quote from Hemingway is an example of us taking something that really is a memoir and acting as though that were history. And the memoir that Hemingway wrote was A Movable Feast. This is my paperback copy because it's easier for me to deal with to find the quote I wanted from. The quote I wanted to talk about here is from his A Movable Feast, his memoir, A Movable Feast. It sounds like I said Immovable Feast. But this is, Hemingway looking back on his years in France, his years as an expatriate writer before he became famous. And he writes this in the late 50s, maybe the early 60s. And by that point, he's outlived a number of the people who he was considered himself to be rivals with, a number of people whose reputations at one time would have been higher than his. And this is memoir as settling a score. He settles a score against Gertrude Stein. He settles his score against other authors, but in some ways most viciously here, I think, against F. Scott Fitzgerald, who he portrays in an incredibly unflattering way. But it's not that portrayal of Fitzgerald that I think is the most damaging if we take Hemingway's A Movable Feast as history. And lots of people do. It's his portrayal of Zelda Fitzgerald, which I think is actually the most damaging thing in the book. And I think that for a long time, and still today, that we look at Zelda through Hemingway's eyes here. Even if you've never read this, if you have the perception that somehow Zelda Fitzgerald was a negative for F. Scott Fitzgerald. Speaking of Zelda, here's my dog Zelda. Zelda! Look, it's Zelda. Zelda came in, she must have heard me saying her name. If we have a negative perception of Zelda in today's idea and her impact on F. Scott Fitzgerald, I think it comes almost directly from A Movable Feast. And here's the quote, which I think is most damaging. Zelda was jealous of Scott's work, and as we got to know them, this fell into a regular pattern. Scott would resolve not to go all night drinking parties and to get some exercise each day and work regularly. He would start to work, and as soon as he was working well, Zelda would begin complaining about how bored she was and get him off on another drunken party. They would quarrel, and then make up, and he would sweat out the alcohol on long walks with me and make up his mind that this time he would really work and would start off well, and then it would start over again. So this is Hemingway really just viciously saying that Zelda is the reason that F. Scott Fitzgerald wasn't more productive, that he wasn't a better writer. And he's writing this, from a time well after both Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald were dead. And he is settling a score, I think, against both of them. And he's more or less making Zelda seem like Yoko Ono in terms of the way people viewed Yoko Ono in the breakup of the Beatles. I don't think it's, I think that's incredibly unfair. One of those things we have to be careful with when we're reading memoir is how the memoirist refers to and describes other real people and how damaging that might be to their historical reputations. Zelda, what are you fussing about? You didn't like that? You didn't think it was fair what Hemingway said about Zelda? I don't either, Miss D. So then, ironically, my fourth quote is from The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I think anybody who saw my video about Fitzgerald knows the quote I'm going to read. It's the very last line in the book, and I happen to think it's one of the great last lines in American literature. And here we go. It's, "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." So that quote, I think, is a great quote about how history affects us. And yet I don't fully agree with it. Fitzgerald here suggests that we're always born all the way back to the past, it seems like, that we can't make any progress. And I don't think that that's true. I think that history can act as a weight, holding people and nations back and, kind of fighting against progress. Fitzgerald meant it more on an individual level than on a national level. But as a historian, I see this is kind of in a more historical way, I guess, historical philosophical way, if I could. I hate to use that term because I'm on shaky ground, philosophically speaking. But the idea that, we're stuck, chained, tethered to this past, which will always kind of reel us in and pull us back, I do think there's some truth in that, but I do think it overlooks the fact that progress is still made. in the book, Fitzgerald suggests that maybe one day we'll get there, whatever that progress is. In the case of The Great Gatsby, it's achieving the life he wants with Zelda, as represented by the green light on the end of her dock. But in a larger sense, I think, and I apply that quote to the world, civilization, the United States, that progress is oftentimes slow. To use a well-worn, metaphor, it's two steps forward and one step back. I have a tendency to view that as being true about history. So I really like that quote at the end of The Great Gatsby, but I don't necessarily agree with it, so I guess that fits in with a contrarian idea. And then the last quote I wanted to read is from C. Vann Woodward's The Burden of Southern History, and it is at the end of his opening essay in this collection, which is called The Historical Dimension. And I think for me, this has probably influenced the way I think about history, or maybe encapsulates the way I think about history more than anything else. So it's a longer quote. I want to read the whole thing and then talk about it briefly. So here's the quote. The historian is fortunate, I think, in sharing a period with literary men of great talent who share so many of his own values, so much of his own outlook and point of view, and so much of his own subject matter. He can afford to take pride in their achievements and comfort in their example. This is no plea for the relaxation of the severe limitations of the historian's discipline, nor for his borrowing the novelist's license. Think about the first quote I read. But once the historian abandons an old and false analogy with the natural sciences and sees that his craft employs no special concepts, nor categories, nor special terminology, he will admit that he attempts to explain history in the same way he explains events in ordinary life, his own as well as that of his fellow men. To me, that is history, and one of the things that oftentimes drives me is crazy as historians taking license and writing as though they're writing a novel and they can just make things up as they go along, as I kind of accused the first author of the Marco Polo novel of doing. I also really bridle against the idea of history as some kind of a quantitative science that we can know, that we can collect data and analyze the data and break down the data, and the data will tell us what is the truth. I don't think that that's ever really possible for history, or perhaps for some other social sciences. I do think it's possible for science. I'm not anti-scientific at all. I'm anti the idea that history itself is science, and we should approach history as scientists approach, a problem, like curing a disease or finding a vaccine or understanding the movement of planets or understanding the nature of the universe. That we can't approach it in the same way, because what we're really doing is just trying to explain what has happened and why that's important and how that impacts us today. And so I really like that quote from C. Vann Woodward. I think that's the only quote I didn't have any problems with. So again, thank you to Marc for tagging me to do this tag. I'm going to tag one person to do this. I don't think Marc tagged Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. And I know Jason keeps a commonplace book in which he writes down quotes that are important to him. I don't know if he writes down quotes that he disagrees with or only those that he finds beautiful or moving or agrees with, but I would love to see Jason, I would love to see you do this tag, my friend. So there you go. If Marc hasn't already tagged you, I'm tagging you. Please, hopefully you can find the time this week or next to get this tag done. I had fun. Sorry if it was boring and I wasn't clear about everything I meant about how these quotes relate to history and my beliefs about history and how I believe that some of them are bad history in one way or another. And I'm not sure this is exactly what Marc had in mind, but there you go. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.